Red Blue JD.
Yeah, I usually like to give the example of an iPhone or a cell phone, which basically has different chips that have been explored as scientific components with different people working upon these things, and then they come together to form the aesthetic thing that then you use into your hand and you speak into. So I'll go through this project, which is basically the AFGRI project that we did in Johannesburg. The whole idea behind this project was the company AFGRI wanted to move into a new space, and they were looking for a project that will convey the ideologies of their company. And the theme that we explored was molding concrete and using new systems of structure to basically give you that entire form and then wrap the building in one system and then give you that holistic continuous movement. And the process that went into carving that entire structure is basically what we call science first, because we believe that you can always dream as much as you want, but at the end of the day you need to know how these things come together and how you create them. So there you can begin to see how we've used to aspire to a certain level of scientific, if you put it that way, scientific breakthrough. And the idea that the building can then manifest itself as a product that has pushed the boundaries on certain elements, and then the multi-part system basically comes in the theme that you can see the facade is made of ceramic tiles that have been broken into pieces, and they've been put into the facade. And this is a way of recycling the materials that these are materials that are put into the project and to make the building seem modest. So in a how would I put it, in a sort of continuous way into the project. So taking you through, and then you can actually see how now the glass comes and forms a separate interface to the building and just gives you that different dynamic to the project. So we try as much as possible to explore this buildings that we do as holistic elements, but then always break it down into different pieces and different elements. And one of the main reasons that we are able to achieve buildings that feel and look complete but have different elements is the structure that we use. We currently exploring, over the years have been exploring a system of creating structure that is basically called the flat slab system. So I don't know how, if any of you have heard about it, but the basic idea is that if you look at the entire building, you cannot see any beams into the system, because we've built the entire structure as tensile members within the concrete. So the whole concrete forms part of the structure, so it serves as that duality versus system that then gives you the form of the building and then works back into the art. So we're quite interested in how can then this system of building then convey a visual feeling to the end user, as opposed to starting with how a building should look and then tailoring that back into the system. So that this is just different components. You can see how the facades interface with the slabs, how the building basically spills out onto the terrace, and how the structures are basically working with the structure in a sense. So the second point I want to talk about is how do you then explore a raw idea and gradually polish it and explore and expound upon it. We predominantly work on commercial architecture. The company is 20 years now. We've been exploring commercial architecture and developed certain systems and certain ideas that have worked with high density projects, be it offices, residential buildings, stadiums, all these typologies of buildings. And one of the principles that we have been exploring, especially developing office blocks, is that we come through an idea where you usually have floor plates that are extensive. So you have a building that's completely expansive, and then when you subdivide it and rent it out, then how the building functions is sort of broken up. So we've developed this idea where we use the forms of the building and then connect them with bridges, so that if you work on a certain side of the building, you can always connect to the other side of the building. And what this means is that these spaces can always be rented out separately, or they can be rented as one complete floor plate. And this still comes back to how the structure has been designed, how the functionality of the building has been explored, and how that ties back into the look of the building. So this is the Alexander Forbes building, also in Johannesburg, and it was developed as a series of office plates that then sit on a platform, and that platform that you see at the bottom is basically the parking silo, and then it rests on a landscaped garden that then spill over into the interiors of the building. And the reason why we follow this as a scientific process, by scientific I don't necessarily mean lab and the general meaning of science. So we basically mean science as a process, as an idea, as a development, as a 1 and 2 and 3, and bringing all this together to create this homogeneous continuous process. So the team that actually worked on this building, they explored this idea of angling the views to a certain direction and then cladding it with dry zinc and then creating views and slicing through so that the light can come in, and the functionality of the building then manifests back into the actual aesthetic of the building. So you can see how the articulation of that has gone in, and basically the whole building and structure is modeled in, we use softwares, one of them is Revit, so we model the whole building to the last detail of how it will come out. Then you interface this with all the coordination processes, and then you get this one whole homogeneous layer, and every discipline, every service then ties back into your building, because we for the longest time the architectural profession has been about engineers and architects and quantity surveyors and all these people fighting and interlocking and always being in collision. But the idea we go for is this ideology of people coming together and building something together, so that an engineer can always teach an architect something, an architect can always teach an engineer something, and it always brings the project to a certain commonality that then makes the whole process easier and more efficient, and people learn more. So then so you can bridges, there's this ideas that have been developed to now support the buildings, and then so sometimes we question this idea that why should something look like it is just because over subsequent generations it's been looking like that. So sometimes we go and develop column systems that then work to that idea of innovating versus the aesthetics. So that's why we come to the table with the idea that architecture should certainly be science first, the process of interrogating and experimenting and percolating these ideas into a certain commonality that then ties back into how you view things, how you experience things. And that column was one of the pertinent ideas into this building that went through several iterations and engineers working together with the architects in the office and just exploring this as a possibility for how the building looks. And then you can see how even the main contractors then work with the engineers and the architects, and they develop these frames that then support the building, and that's the process and how it goes through. And finally you see how that then looks into the building, and it supports the bridges and how that then looks visually. So the idea is certainly doable. What we basically believe is that especially within Africa, that we have focused so much on the aesthetics, on how things look, as opposed to going back and questioning and exhibiting how things should work, so that we develop these things together and innovate and see how that then affects our spaces and our architecture. So we're just keen to push that boundary and explore that idea that there's always a duality to design. There's always that idea that you can go beyond what is common. So you can see the bridges there where if you basically rent the top floor plate, you can then rent it separately, or you can have the 1, 2, and 3 as one floor plate, or you can still break it down, and then we develop it with a core in the middle and just walk through these iterations of design. You can see how the bridges then tie back and how that visually articulates the central cause and how the subsequent spaces are experienced by the users. And then if you look down onto that space, then you can see how the outdoors is basically brought in, not necessarily in a sense to appear sustainable, but to create spaces that people can then come and experience at the base of the building. So that's the subsequent views and light wells at the top, and so you can just see how the different iterations and how the detailing and the spaces come together to create this space, these ideas. So the third thing that we are basically keen on exploring is how do you create sense within design but still have stability. So there's this idea, and I keep reiterating this, that in ways that certain be it cultures, be it social aspects, be it aspirations, that they should remain and stay the same. But then we come to this with certain spaces that we feel should change, should move beyond what they look like. And sometimes this comes down to how you treat a simple toilet, how you treat a simple sink. So I'll just take you through one of the designs that was done in the office on how an ablution should basically look like. And that's a toilet block in one of the buildings that still in Johannesburg that has been done. And this will basically explore how the whole process of creating the things that come from our minds onto the site. And the idea is to use the skills that we have, which is basically creativity and the tools that we have, the softwares, to come up with ideas that go beyond and challenge what things should be. Not necessarily to challenge them because we want to, but to build onto a body of knowledge that then explores into the next generation. And I feel especially that this is pertinent in Africa because we're still a young continent, we're growing, but there's so much zeal, there's so much fire that's burning within the continent that there's all this space to still move into. So the basic concept was that an axonometric idea of this, how that ablution should be like, how we can then take single sinks and put them into one thing and then tie this thing into a whole exploration of a form. And then that's the first step. But then, as we all know, in the real world, things need to work. So from that, then you need to bring it into its functionality. So then you basically find how the structure works. How would you then go and build this thing that you've just brought from your mind? So then you need to model it, see how it will work, and then you need to workshop it with people so that then because ultimately as architects, there's very few architects that actually physically build what they design. So most of the time you end up working with people, and the interesting thing is the people you work with definitely know some things that you don't know, and you know some things that they don't know. And as much as there's a pedestal that sometimes we try and put ourselves on, the reality is every person knows something different. So there's this process that you go and work with people on site, with your subcontractors, with your suppliers, your manufacturers, and you develop these ideas. We try to look at them as ideas and not necessarily as products, because the people that experience these spaces use them very differently. There's someone that basically doesn't care how a toilet looks like. There's someone that does care how it looks like. So you're not necessarily designing for extremes, you're designing for the middle ground. And so you can just see how that as an idea has been developed from a simple axonometric model, to how it then comes in, to how it then is developed further, and then finally you can see from the render to the actual photograph. And that's how the process basically goes into this idea of not necessarily designing for a visual feel, but designing for a process. And what this means is that the Paragon Architects has basically gone into this missions of designing this internal spaces and buildings and the products that we do as systems. And the knowledge that is gained from such a process is then put into a different pipeline, and then it goes into developing certainly other things. And then we always try to not necessarily do something new, but explore something better. So the idea of being prosaic then comes into the picture, and basically this idea that things should eventually evolve and move and proceed and process. I was having an interesting conversation with someone a while back, and they were basically explaining how they were doing research, and they went into a community, and all the ideas that they had in their head were challenged by the community that they went to, because they thought that the community they went to needed certain aspects, and the community basically told them that no, this is not what we need, this is how we live. So it's this idea that you open your mind and you are willing to take in everything that is around you. So I'll take you through a project called the BDO, and the idea behind this project was to challenge the box as a basic idea. How then do you create office spaces that are in constant tectonic relationships, but still function as spaces that people can work in? Because it's one thing to develop ideas that are prosaic, but they ideally have to be vibrant. They have to be spaces that work. They have to be spaces that exist within a physical world. And the BDO was basically an office block that took the box as an office, the traditional box as an office, and the traditional stone as a material, and tries to push this forward and to bring this into the 21st century. So walking through Kigali, this is probably my first time here, and I've seen there's quite an extensive use of brick, and that's one material that basically touches across most of Africa. It's from the earth. It's a material that can be taken forward to beyond what we see it being used for. So a good example that I always try express is, if you look at that building and you look at the building to the right, they're basically made of the same material, but they've been expressed in completely different ways. So you can see just how, by angling the building, by shaping it in certain ways, by creating views and creating angles, you can then try and achieve certain different explorations to these spaces and to these materials. And for me personally, I'm not interested in being different. I'm just interested in progressing and in exploring new ideas. So the building basically expresses the materiality and the aspiration to create something that progresses the profession, that progresses the typology that has been stagnant for quite a while. So all the projects that I'm basically taking you through show you how these spaces then percolate from the inside. They step onto the outside, onto these terraces, these platforms that are created, and then the whole program of the building ties back into one system. So that's the actual street view. You can see how the brick and the concrete have been interfaced together. You can see the building on the right, and you can see how the stark contrast between these two spaces appear. And there's always room for challenge. There's always room for exploring it in different ways. But basically the idea we're going for is this concept that innovation should be the main thing that happens within architecture, because is that in everything else, practically everything else, science drives the industry. If you look at how the phone, the technology that has been changing over the years, the cars. I mean, we're not running anymore. We're not running from here all the way to the other side of town. We're getting into motorbikes, we're getting into cars, we're getting onto bicycles. So everything is changing. Our social interactions are changing. Now there's phones, there's WhatsApp, there's ways in which we are changing, but architecture for the longest time, especially within the continent, has remained within a certain safety zone. And this is not necessarily bad. It just, in our personal opinion, I feel like we need to develop bodies of knowledge and to create and to innovate and to move beyond certain spaces. So you can see how the brick has been explored, and how this the simple materials that we use within the project are then taken further and further. So the idea is not necessarily to be radical or to be different. It's just to create a new sense of belonging and a new sense of identity. And I'll take you through one of the projects that challenges the concept of space as a square, as a box. And this is a project that was developed by Create Spaces and push technology further and further and create these new theories of scientific research and to build on knowledge. So it's a shopping mall that's still in the early stages of development, but you can see how simple materials are then taken and carved and shaped and create new and interesting spaces. At least we seem to think so. So you can see how a simple balustrade then goes and ties back and becomes a staircase, and how lighting is shaped and pulled through into the facade, and it serves a system of duality. And the interesting thing with some of these projects is you basically spend your entire life trying to make it work, and that's where now architecture becomes an interesting concept. It becomes a process of creating new knowledge and building and creating new ways of doing things, which ultimately this knowledge is never lost, because then it ties back and percolates into the rest of the process and the systems. So an interesting logic is I feel that we try as much as possible to understand the structural component of buildings, how the services then tie back, because some of these things are usually swept under the carpet and we try and resolve them later. So we try to, as much as possible, treat the building as one common thing, but then go into the building and break it down into its different parties, so that we can then start to shape these things and form creative and bearing buildings that then come and sit onto the site as new senses of innovation. So that's the building on the right. It's the probably the first facade scheme that was done in Sandton that explored vertical articulation. The same on the left, where simple materials have been used to express the environment. The trees have been perforated and the facades have been built onto the spandrels, and you can see how the whole building shapes from this functionality that it then explores. So I'll just take you quickly through some of these ideas and the platforms and how the columns are basically not just columns. They're things that shape and frame the spaces that we live in, and the landscaping and the facades, and just developing these things in as ideas of as basic ideas that then frame spaces. The perilous versus the benign process, I'll take you through a project called SASOL, which is the biggest project currently that the office has completed. So the SASOL comes from the idea that the company wanted to create this new office space that brought all their facilities and all their stuff into one building that expressed the idea that SASOL was. And so the project was developed as a series of offices where A represents a different department, H, D, I, J, F. They all represent these separate environments, and then the process then becomes the architecture then becomes the process of developing these buildings. So you can see how as it looks there, it's basically scattered departments, and then the next step is now to bring these departments into one system, one continuous system that then ties into a continuous thing. And then how then do you relate A and H, because now it seems from that diagram it's too far. How do you relate C and G? Then you go and start exploring that as a diagram that then tries to visually develop programs for the building that then makes all the parties relate. And then how do you then bring that as part of a building and then connect these different spaces? So it's just a process of exploring and using software and using knowledge and using available research and systems within the company that have been ongoing to create new ideas and new functional elements. So that just explains how the whole bubble has been developed into now the program of the building, and then that now forms part of the program that connects all these things. And then once you develop all these spaces, then you look at how materials can be used, and then you create such spaces that then employees can then use to develop these spaces. And an interesting concept you can see is that the project that I showed you earlier, which was Alexander Forbes, explored the bridges as connecting elements, and then this now takes the bridges further. The spans now get longer. You develop them in different ways. You sculpt them in different ways, and this just shows you a process of how then that is developed, how the bridge is isolated from the building, and how it then gets developed as a separate element that has been picked from the main program. And then you can see how the actual construction happens, because ultimately you have to go back into the real world. You can dream all you want, but if you can build it in architecture, it's basically useless. So that just shows you how the tensile systems have been designed and how the architects work together with the engineers to develop these ideas that then try to explore spaces in different ways. For us, it's basically the same idea that was achieved in a different project, but now developed further, because you learn new things, you experience new ideas, you experience new spaces. You ultimately, research is all about that. It's about finding the answer and then losing the answer and then finding it again and then developing it further. And that just explores how the building performs thermally, how different facade envelopes are explored, and how the facade was developed. And that shows you how the articulation of the facade has been done, and how visual zones have been explored, how the office as a block has to be functional, it has to provide views, it has to keep the heat out, it has to be a breathing skin. And you can see how the Moira effect was basically used to develop the facade and to create an identity for the company. So then you can see just how the process was developed and how we went through exploring that facade skin as a continuous idea. So it just goes through different iterations of the same building, and then you can see the final product, which is basically a combination of all these processes and all these ideas that then come together into the one building. And the interesting thing about the team that work on this project is they're quite proud of that cantilever at the top, which is basically one of the largest spans of cantilevers within the country that has been done. So it's just going into iterations of ideas that then always push the boundary, but pushing the boundary not necessarily to be different, I'll repeat this, but just to create new bodies of knowledge that then can be used onto different projects and to different processes, and then they serve to work within the project as a continuous idea. So these are the interiors of the project. You can see how the previous ablution block has been developed further in this and refined, and elements within that project taken and explored as different ideas. So there you can see the cantilever of the building and how the whole scheme has been explored as one continuous idea. And you can see how the basic bridge has been supported and how the column is just not a column, it's an aesthetic element that explores different ideas. So I'll just take you through all these ideas, and then this brings us to an element of of architecture, where it basically talks on how to be sociable and still be reticent within architecture. How do you design buildings that speak to the person on the street within a different, but still not within a different language to the person that inhabits the building, but still gives all these people that experience the building the aspiration, the sort of idea that you can always aspire and achieve and push for more. So a good question that people try and ask me is that the buildings that I'm basically showing here are all in Johannesburg, and they are developed in these industries that have been developing over the years, and systems have been perfected. And then where does that leave us? That takes the common principles, the common customs, the common traditions that we have in our culture, in our customs, and then pushes this forward and takes this body of knowledge that has been developed over a period of years and push it into the next level. So we basically had a theme, a site that was simple, a rectangular site on Ralph Bunche Road, and the client wanted a building, an apartment building that would express the identity that him and the client team has been developing over the years as a developer. So I'll just take you through the process of how then do you ascribe simple traditions and simple ideas onto a client's visions. How do you, within the continent, work through all the challenges that we have, all the customs that we have that we can use and harness, all the traditions, all the sociable aspects that make the continent great. How then do we take this and use it in a 21st century way and take this forward? So the way design sometimes happens is it's the simplest thing that you can explore, or you can go through complex processes. For me, developing this project was basically a process that takes the site as is, takes the brief as is, and directly and physically interprets it as an idea. So the brief involved parking silo, a tower, and a rooftop garden at the top. So we basically masked that, like literally did a box, that's the parking, did a residential tower, and did a box at the top that was the swimming pool, or the place for entertainment. So then with that diagram and different processes and separate discussions and design meetings, then you start to explore this as an idea. So how then do we push certain elements back? How then do we begin to work on separate programs within the building to explore this as an idea? So then how do you tie the belt of the street onto the building? How do you extend this green zone, sort of an idea where I call it giving back the green. So that then shows you how the street as a green belt has been tied back into the frontage of the building, and how that then ties back into the facade, onto the platform, goes all the way to the top, and works as an entertainment level. So then you can see how different programs express the idea, and how the tower basically works within the structure of the building, how that explores the functionalities of the building, and you can see the programs and how that has been explored, and the actual building of how it will look like, and then how the structure is being developed, this idea of not necessarily using columns and slabs and beams as structural elements, but as new levels of developing knowledge. So then you can see how the standard building in Nairobi uses downstands, which is basically what most buildings have been exploring for the longest time. And what we did is, so the slab usually sits like that, you have your downstands, but what we did in this building is we did not want to see the beams, but also the dynamic of the economic cost within Nairobi sometimes dictate that you have to use structures in the way that they've been done. So what we then went and did is we rotated the structure so that we immersed the beams and into the slab. So when I show you the next image, you'll see how those are the beams. The construction process will basically be like this. You build your beams and then you build your slab. So then you don't see any beams into the building. So it sort of works like a flat slab system, but it's not really a flat slab system, but it tries to work with the local knowledge that's there, but develop it further. So you're using systems that have been developed over years, and you're tying this with traditions that have been explored within these cities. So it's basically a process where you're not coming in and kicking and pushing out all the ideas that people have been developing for the longest time, because these ideas are strong and are pertinent and have certain reasons why they're being explored. So how do you then combine those and combine the knowledge that you have and work together, which is basically the process that I call sci-fi. So it's an idea where you use existing upon knowledge to create visual things. So then that brings you back into the actual building as a structure, and then that is now the whole idea of developing the skin of the building as an element that ties back into Nairobi. So what we went and did is we used the bluestone. There's a stone in Nairobi called the bluestone. I think here you have the volcanic stone. So I think that's the one that's made the new school. So there we have a bluestone that it's quite common within the country, and we're using it as part of the cantilever that then supports that entire thing. And we've gone through different iterations, and even now we're still designing it on how can we then express that section there. You can see this is the last image that we had developed previously, and you can see from there's actually a bird. So the client's family, the crest for the client is basically an eagle, and we've developed an eagle there with the perforations of the building. So basically laying the stone and then leaving gaps to express the client's identity onto the building. So the facade basically goes through the same iteration at the top, where we look into how can we then use the building's facade to also express the client's identity, but then take this idea of science forward. How do we innovate and explore and take the process further? So we went through probably like 3 or so weeks developing perforations for the building. So these are tiny dots within the building that express where as you go up onto the building, then the building becomes less and less perforated, but then it becomes more and more wider. So the windows open more at the top so that you get better views, and then at the bottom you have this more perforated spaces that then bring in the light through those perforations. So it's just an idea of expressing the facade and the edifice of the building as a scientific exploration of architecture in a sense. So then that shows you how the building looks like. The parking silo at the bottom, the tower in itself, and the entertainment level at the top. And then close up you can see how those perforations have been explored, and how the green belt then on the left, if you look, we've had the parking silo where the ramps are. Then you can see how we've covered that with a skin and then planted plants that are indigenous to the country to basically give back the green. So the perforations at the top basically show you how the building has been developed and explored within. And then one of the main client requirements for this project was that the building has to appear tall. In as much as it is tall at the moment at 24 levels, it still has to appear tall, which is basically the client's wishes to explore an aspiration of moving forward, taking the continent further. And so we went through this idea of having fins within the building. I think there's an image that basically shows it further, so you can see the fins at the bottom there, how they explore, make the building look sort of taller with that idea. And then we go into processes of developing even the internal spaces as facades, and how then do we open up the building so that at any given time we can always bring the outdoors into the building. So you can see how those fins are lighting up the facade, and how we still giving back the green even onto the 24th level. We still planting plants around the building and just bringing back the nature into that building, and how that we use structure to shape spaces, and how we push these elements that are seemingly sometimes ignored. How do you then create these spaces and then shape the actual functionality of the building. So we went through this iteration where we have this extensive slab on the building, and then we cut out a big hole in the middle just to bring in the sun. So then the idea of in versus out, bringing the outdoors in, and how then the perforations tie back into the building. Have these balconies that basically have sections for views, and then have sections where light can then start playing around with these spaces. So that's a building that we currently developing in Nairobi, and it's exploring basically the exact same principles that buildings all across the office have been exploring. And in as much as it's not the same systems, it's systems that have been made to adapt and to sort of start to catch up with the developed world in a sense. So it's always this idea that we need to find how things work, develop things back and process them, and then tie back into our ideas and feelings. So then how do we leverage these ideas that we have developed over several years, and how do we create sometimes spaces that percolate from the largest scale to the smallest scale? So this is a project that personally I've been working on. It's a house in Kenya, still in Kenya. It's called the Order House. So basically, order is basically means in my native language, it basically means it's like a personalized element. It's order basically means my home or my house. And the client in this project was a couple from Nairobi. They were they just come back from their work outside the country, and they were settling back into the country, and they'd built a house in Nairobi, and then they were quite keen to build a separate house in the countryside. But then so when I met them, the client basically went into the husband basically told me, Edwin, we're basically looking for a building that will be built in the rural areas, but we don't want to leave Nairobi. So my process of developing this project was, how then do you design a building that leaves the city but still doesn't necessarily leave it? And that's where this idea of exploring aspirations and sci-fi is an idea. How then do you design for clients that have seen the world, have basically seen everything they want to see? How then do you take them from that environment, and how then do you take them into a lesser busier space, but then how do you still achieve those elements within that setting? So certainly the project is an aspirational project. It requires certain things to tie back to Nairobi, as is in Kisumu. So the main thing that I went through was to develop it as a system that breaks it down into the simplest of what a house is. How do you make a box into a house? So the first diagram basically shows this huge box, and that huge box is basically the house. And then the second diagram shows you, it's not quite clear, but it shows you how the box has been sliced in the middle, and then that corridor taken all the way to the end. So it's basically using real world spaces. A corridor is a corridor, a bathroom is a bathroom, a bedroom is a bedroom, but then how does that space tie back into the overall design? So it's basically a process more in the functionality of the building, the science of the building, the core, the backbone, the vertebrae of the building is more useful for this process as the final product. So then the third diagram shows you how the corridor is then pushed back, and then the fourth diagram shows you how there's a slice in the middle. The slice in the middle actually comes from one of the client's later critique. So you start with them quite extensively, just exploring this idea and trying to see exactly what they needed. And the husband kept so it's a heavily cultural thing. The husband basically kept saying, I don't want the the kids' spaces next to my spaces. I need something to separate them. So they went through this idea where they wanted to take that space as a master bedroom and take it completely. So before we got to that level, our building was basically in the middle, and they wanted to take that space and push it completely outside that scheme. And the whole idea behind having this simple box was so that scheme is compact, it's efficient, and it's the whole cost of the building comes down, because then when you start spreading things, then you start incurring extra cost. So the idea was to insert this box in the middle that basically breaks the whole building into two, but doesn't necessarily break it apart. So then we insert that box in the middle, and then the client expressed this idea that he wanted a glass building, but the primary concern with glass buildings, especially in Kisumu, where it can get quite hot sometimes. There is no summers, but sometimes it gets quite hot. So the idea was to take a huge, sort of like a roof, how you roof a building, and just stretch it so that you have your normal roof, and stretch it so that it's longer, and then it cantilevers over the building. And then what that does is gives you a roof over the building, and then what just shows you how the program works is an idea. So it's simple: lounge, dining, kitchen, pantry, bedroom, big box in the middle to separate the parents from the kids, and then the master bedroom at the end, and then the swimming pool. There's a funny story about the swimming pool where the husband basically never learned how to swim, but he wanted a swimming pool. So he wanted this idea where he can use the swimming pool without necessarily swimming in the pool. So it's just like an informal discussion that went through, and some of these ideas actually developed when you actively speaking with this client. So so just thinking through what the clients wanted and exploring and sketching and developing these ideas, then came up with this idea of why shouldn't I then just push the swimming pool under the building, so that you lift the building and push the swimming pool back, so that the client can then step out where the two figures are, and can just sit there and dip their legs in the pool. And the husband quite liked that idea of just stepping out and sitting and dipping his legs in the pool and feeling like he's part of the swimming pool. As his wife explores this pool, and then having that podium as a machine room that basically creates that interface of a landscaped space. And then so that basically just shows you how the session is, how that has been developed as a simple box with a party at the edge, and then roof at the top is an extensive cantilever. And then the final product looks like this, which is basically a big glass box with an extensive cantilever and a red box there that splits these two connects that as a continuous thing. So this just shows you the different elements that have come together to make this into a complete scheme. So it's basically the complexities of the urban environment, how you sustainably develop this project, how do you then intrinsically separate these spaces but still unify them with a box, and then how does then the working concepts within the project work, what does the client really want, so that we're not necessarily exploring ideas that we think are better because we're better suited to design and not represent the client's ideas. So that's basically the building as an explored idea that pushes this principles that we're trying to work with and achieve the building as like a scientific research as a process that then develops, and ideas that are incubated and developed and then turned into real things. So this shows you how the swimming pool works into the building. And so in a nutshell, that's basically for me what architecture within the continent should be aspiring to. And so I think that's it. Is an idea.
Thank you.
Sure. So
Now that
take any questions.
For questions and answers, so please with order.
Then, yeah, study.
Thank you. My name is Simon from the second year.
Yeah.
Thank you for the good presentation. And, I think you are going to share it with us. I have a problem.
Problem means question.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
You see, those projects, they are good in such scientific way, I mean architectural way, and artistic way. I'm wondering about the problem of money, because
Yes,
it seems
yeah.
they are very expensive.
Yeah, so well, expensive is relative. So the projects that have been developed are basically they've basically been developed with a specific budget to them, and the thing that as Paragon Architects and me as an architect, actually the main reason why we went into this process of developing architecture as a scientific process was to value engineer buildings so that the cost, the functionality, and the product as a whole ties back. So some of these buildings have been developed to give back, to bring back the revenue stream into the building. So the way they've been developed are basically products that serve to be investment portfolios for these companies. So that's why they've been developed in certain ways. I don't know if I'm answering your question. So your question was, how do you design for smaller budgets? Okay, so basically the last project that I showed, it's not extensively expensive as a building. The budgets for that project are the same as the budgets for well, not necessarily the same, but if I was designing for an aspirational client with a project that's 250 square meters, and I designed it in a traditional way, and I designed that building, the budgets will basically tie back. Where you need to be careful about budgets is that you need to know how to aspire to progress, but then keep within the budget. So it's basically, how do you get from here to say where we're staying faster, but still pay cheaper? So it's about thinking, I guess, in a certain way. How do you then maybe not take a taxi? How do you use a motorbike? So it's basically that process of developing ideas. It takes longer, it's twice as hard, it's twice as tough, but then it's what I would say is it's doable. Basically, like an idea of hiding the structure or using the structure to explore the space is a new thing. Taking your building and building your slab like that versus turning the beam, there's no cost variation there. So it's basically the idea that expresses the innovation that expresses the idea differently, that makes the buildings look differently sometimes. Yeah, so definitely there's a cost implication. There is, like with everything else, there is projects that are high budget, middle budget, and low budget. But I think it's usually the idea that expresses within the architecture that makes a project successful or not. And I wouldn't want to look at projects as visual things. They are not. I don't think architecture, in as much as it is, yes, which might seem contradictory, but in as much as architecture is a visual thing, it should serve a certain function. So we should aspire to engineer buildings in ways that are definitely better than than are being done now, but still create new bodies of knowledge within that. Maybe that's a question that then you need to ask yourself: how do I, if I want to build a box, but all the time rectangular projects are more expensive than circular projects, for example, how do I make a rectangular project cheaper? Then you go into a research process of developing ways in which a rectangular project can be cheaper than a circular project, but still achieve your goal in a way. So it's basically a process of research. That's what I'm trying to get at.
I'm Robert from
Yes.
And you see that those projects in South Africa, Johannesburg, are like curvy, like they have more curves. And
Okay.
those ones in Kenya, they have like those rectangles. And I'm asking like the reason why. And on top of that, I want to know like to achieve this idea of science first. What should be done to achieve that?
Okay. That's actually quite a good question. The idea of carving buildings versus having buildings straight is basically a programmatic issue. Does the curve serve a function? If it serves a function, then have it within the building. If it doesn't, then make it straight. So I don't think there's really a right or wrong answer, because the buildings that you see are results of products, of processes within themselves to make them products. So there's definitely certain elements within the building where if it curves, then it's more functional, and if it doesn't, then it's less. So the building that I've shown you, the high-rise that I've shown you in Nairobi, basically in that case doesn't have a curve because the initial idea for the client was to maximize the site. But the other projects, some of them that you've seen, if it curves in plan, then it's responding to the site in some cases, or it's trying to maximize the views. And then if it's curving, like the first one that I showed you, it's basically a response to the structure. So sometimes if you curve the building, then it might be towards the program or to respond to a certain structure. So it's basically ties to a specific reason within that specific project. I think no two projects are the same. So that's the reason why that occurs. And then the other question you asked was, how do you then explore this idea of science first? I think primarily the first thing that you need to do is to be honest with yourself. Because sometimes we explore architecture as superficial visual things, but for me I'm quite interested, and this is a process I've been going through with Paragon Architects as an architectural company that has been there for quite a while. So the main frustration I had was you go into certain developed countries like Europe, Switzerland, those countries, you see these highly specialized buildings, you see these highly specialized systems, and then you come to Africa and you come into the continent and into certain countries, and you don't really see a difference why this thing should not be explored. I mean, the primary reason why you given like his raise is cost. It's too expensive. It's this. But these are usually just fears. They're usually just fears that are raised without necessarily questioning or going deeper and doing research. So the reason why I'm saying architecture should inherently be science first, especially within Africa, is we need to find how things work. How do you, if you want to do something, if you want to design a Zaha Hadid building, if you want to design a social project, if you want to design a commercial project, how does the functionality of the building aspire to give the people that you're designing for aspirations? It's the same thing that why do you relate with a certain musician? Why do you relate with certain movies? It's because there's certain aspirational values that you aspire to, some values of excellence or some values of stepping up on the social ladder. So architecture should ultimately also give people that feeling. And for me personally, I feel like our culture and our tradition are so strong, especially within Africa. They're so strong. They're one of the few places left that still have that strong sense of culture that percolates through the whole cultures and traditions. So how then, the question is, how then do we put science first into our systems? I think this answer is probably all around. We have innovations that are being done all across the board. A good example in Kenya is the M-Pesa. I don't know if any of you know about the M-Pesa system, which is a system of mobile banking which has basically been developed, and the biggest guy to the smallest person, to my grandmother, to my the person that has never gone to school can basically use it. So that's like I'm seeing challenges within society and then trying to fix them with solutions that are intellectually superior in a way. So I probably won't give you like a specific example or an answer, but for me it's solving challenges in society, literally the third step near you in intellectual ways, I think. So I wouldn't necessarily say go and do this, go and do that, but I'm just saying like design and architecture and what we basically do can be always expressed as an intellectual step, as an intellectual progress. Yeah, so that's basically what I call science first. Like that's how it's just a word, but what it means is innovating. It's basically a process of innovation, from beating drums to call people for parties to using a cell phone. So the spaces in the bottom are basically parking silos. So the rules, the regulations in Johannesburg require certain number of parking bays to the buildings area. So if the standards are usually one parking bay for every 100 meters squared for a building that's an office block. So if your project like this project, if it's a 65,000 square meters, then you can see how many parking bays you need. So you might need 6,500 cars to park there. So sometimes you sink the whole building down and create parking levels. So you don't really need natural ventilation sometimes in parking level. But for some of these buildings that are designed, you have air that's being pumped out. So you have systems that are pumping the air out and bringing the air in some of these buildings. Here. Okay, and let me just go at the back and then I'll come back.
I have a question. I have two questions. The first one is I think this building have this atrium and at the top can move forward to see and found the atrium is almost covered.
There. Maybe it's the first building. It's this building. Sorry. There.
Mainly the design of this highlights building that are hosting more people. Yeah, this atrium have more functions like ventilation, like natural lighting, as and it is my eyes. Since this openings
actually, so the glazed sections that then bring in the light into the building.
only lighting.
Yes.
Since this atrium is really open to this space. Since the air tends to rise, where are you going to
Check the air out.
yes.
Okay, so the reason why, so most of the office buildings that are designed by the office are completely sealed. So we have no openable sections, and this is basically because of certain rules that govern how rentable spaces are designed, but then also how the facades have been designed in this specific environments. So the reason why I'm approaching this presentation as a science first thing, and it's a very good question, is because this building will not work in Rwanda. It will not work in Kenya. So design is a process. So these buildings, some of the buildings, actually most of the buildings in Johannesburg, especially commercialized buildings, have to be sealed because clients ultimately rent buildings that perform according to the standards that they want. So if they want high ventilated buildings, they'll rent out a ventilated building. But chances are that, especially in Johannesburg, most of the buildings are being built by double skin facades that then play with the intensity of light coming in, but then they're completely sealed and then mechanically ventilated, basically because of the requirements of retail spaces within Johannesburg. So if you design spaces that are not mechanically ventilated, then they'll not get rented. So I'm approaching that as a commercial. So commercial architecture is completely different from other genres of architecture. So you have to achieve certain requirements within buildings for them to be, like he's saying, some of these buildings are high budgeted projects and they need to bring back the money. They need to be rented out. Yeah. So the atrium there is fully lit by natural light, but some of them are actually naturally ventilated and some of them are not, depending on the requirements of specific projects. Yeah.
Last question is about the last project that is in Kenya, which is this water house.
Yes.
Since you told us the story of the construction and the process of the 49 years in order to construct this house, it seems like you have been provoked by the wishes of the end user as is the law.
Yes.
So, by providing glasses, is this area of
Kisumu, yes.
Is there other buildings that we are built with their glass concerns as a
Yeah. So the thing is that that building is an artwork. It's been created with the client's wishes, and ultimately the client is the user of the building. So you might design the building in the way that you want it to look. You might design it in the best way that you think you want it. But at the end of the day, the client and the client team, which is his husband and the wife and the kids, are the ones that are going there to eat, sleep, and inhabit the building. So you're going to step away, come back to Kigali, and then they're going to use the building. And if you design it in the way that they hadn't expected or a vision for these spaces, they'll hate you forever. So the reason why the glass is there is because they needed views. They've been living in spaces where they are uninhabited. And usually the biggest stigma about glass is the heat gain, right? So that's why we went and extended that entire cantilever to sort of shade the building. So it's using dynamic ideas to resolve. It's a give and take process with, I might want maybe timber fins, but the client doesn't want that. So then how do I design for the client's needs, but still achieve a building that performs within the principles that have been explored, I think. I don't know if I've answered.
Thank you very much. My question is a personal experience as an not on what you presented. Me as a beginner, we have to do my first project.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, how do you organize yourself? How do you design from the time you know have the project, from the time you release the plot? How do you do throughout the process?
Okay, so predominantly the first thing we ideally ought to do, which I do sometimes more than is required, is spend time with the client, understand what they need. The first thing is usually, and it's also an exercise in you defining yourself as a human being and being sociable. So how do you speak to people? How do you express your ideas? How do you take in their ideas? How do you speak once and listen twice? So that's the first process that I go through. Mainly because I want every project to be like a philosophical journey, like an idea that I explore. I'm quite interested in that idea of building into the philosophy that I'm working towards, maybe for the next 10 years. So I try as much as possible to speak to clients, try and get why do they need a house there to have glass, why, so just to understand where they're coming from, because people's customs, traditions, cultures, ideologies, thoughts are very strong. These ideas that have been, like for you, if you're maybe over 20, you've developed these ideas over 20 years. So you don't want someone coming in who thinks they know, telling you how to live your social life in a different way. So that's the one thing. And clients are people. Architecture never serves anyone else. It serves people. So spend time with people. The client, listen to them. It's never one-time process. There's that. And then the second thing is I'm doing lots of research basically. How has it been done before? Has it been done? I'm reading lots of books, collecting libraries, watching documentaries, sometimes movies. Sometimes you get an idea from the weirdest sources. So even walking through certain cities or whatever. So it's basically that. Speaking first, understanding the brief, which is speaking to the client. There's no other way without speaking to the client. And then basically organizing your ideas and trying to now synthesize that. And then, yeah, it's just a simple process. It's just how you go about it. I think that makes that difference. And then also maybe loving what you do and developing and not being rigid to change, and I guess, and exploring things beyond your comfort zone sometimes. Yeah.
I just want to ask about the strategic ways have you used in the breathing. You showed us extended one where the upper part is extending from the main structure.
Mm-hmm.
How have you covered such things? Because memory, we know it is hard to extend the main structure compared to the main structure.
Yeah.
How have you applied such things in order to exist as a real life, and what kind of materials which are good in that way?
Okay. So it's predominantly steel and concrete. There's no special material. But how that has been achieved in this specific case is it's been done in also other projects. So I'll just show you an example, an actual breakdown of how that was done. Okay, so I don't know if you will. I need a view that shows me from the side. Sorry. So, okay, it's not clear here, but basically what happens is I'll give an example. If you take like a stick, like a simple stick, and then you sink it into the ground straight, like 90 degrees straight, like that. And then you take another stick and then you sink it at an angle like this into the ground. Which one do you think will be easy to kick and for it to fall? You're saying the inclined, you're saying? 90. How many people think it's 90? How many people think the 90-degree one will fall more faster than the one that's like this? Okay, so let me ask you another question of the same analogy. If I'm standing like this, right, and then Billy comes and pushes me over, right, and then if I'm standing like this, and then Billy comes and pushes me over, which one is easier for me to fall than the other? That's your answer. So if I literally go and do it, sink a stick like this, because the forces that are working on your stick that way are predominantly different than when it's standing this way. This way they are uniform. This way you have different tensile and compression forces. Yeah. So how that building was designed was that column does slants that way. So when it slants, the actual cantilever is not what you're seeing. So the column, let me just point it. The column starts from here, right, and slants that way and ends there, right? So it goes all the way, ends there, right, and then is held here. There's a column here. So it's like something that does that, and then it's hung. And it's sometimes as simple as that. But you have to have that knowledge and that thought to even start interrogations with your engineer. Sometimes if you don't have that information, it might not be possible. So it's just different ideas of exploring how you can do something, I guess.
I don't have a question for you. Congratulations for the... I'm a lecturer here. I'm Kenyan, but been organized for 30 years now.
Cool,
So
thanks.
I just want to bring the students back to the question of first-year student about courses. Because I think some carried away to fight propaganda that good is expensive, sustainable is expensive.
Exactly.
It's expensive. Did you hear this kind of things? What is this word? What is the opportunity cost? The 5 years we have had this discussion about common house, and I'm very happy with this last project because you know the concept of the rural home that we were studying. Now you know how deep it can go. And this is Kisumu, this is not Nairobi. And maybe you start to understand the frustrations of the author of the article of Tangi Ndemo that I'm sure the architect is aware of.
Yeah.
That starts calling such projects state capital for the reasons that you very well know. So we are not going to go into this discussion. But what is the cost of that smile on the client's face after you've given them what they wanted? Not only what they wanted, but made them believe more in themselves and made sure that the ideas that they had can actually go to the ground. What is the cost of that? What is the cost of architects coming here all the way to tell us about 6 or 7 projects that I saw all of you nodding to? What is the cost of that? Yeah. So sometimes we are held back with issues. I don't know what these issues are coming. This is, for example, the last project is someone's home, and I think the 30 years know this idea of house and home. The home has no cost. Yes, they can tell you, talk to them, they will tell you why. Yeah, people have argued that there is no monetary value attached to a home. The commercial projects also are almost at the same kind of philosophy. Not that somebody believes in it and they want to do it. So the only thing you can do as students of architecture is to work really, really hard.
Exactly, yeah.
Work really, really hard. It's okay that we've been referring to Le Corbusier and Renzo Piano and Chinella and everybody else. If we start getting this, and Boniface and Sylvie and everybody else, then we are getting somewhere, isn't it? So you can only promise yourself that, yes, I have seen so many examples of projects. It doesn't have to be done all the time. Yes, of course, we are really happy for what they are doing. But there's a limit as to how much one person can do. So when we add more voices and more, when we make this gospel, it's like a gospel. If you make it more visible, I think we will get somewhere in terms of architecture. Whether sci-fi or not, but the commitment to your idea, to your study as students. Yeah, I'm really happy to see so many of you today because this is not a presentation you hear on the street every other time. So I encourage your bodies to come. So thank you guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Red Blue JD.